The marble hush of this congressional hearing room deepened as Judge Ailen Canon adjusted her glasses, the sweep of her black robe cutting hard against the mahogany panels behind her. Across the table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the Texas Democrat many assumed had walked straight into a career-ending ambush. The tension was thick enough to slice. Before we get into how a first-term lawmaker from Dallas dismantled a federal judge's arguments on live television tap subscribe and ring the notification bell, you won't want to miss what happens when legal training collides with unflinching political nerve. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. This story is rippling from coast to coast. Moments earlier, Judge Canon had entered with the composure of someone who had never dropped a case in open court. She'd come ready to defend controversial rulings in marquee matters, and most observers expected her to glide past any challenge. Republicans on the Judiciary Committee had practically rolled out a velvet rope treating her like a returning champion. But Jasmine Crockett had brought something nobody anticipated. It wasn't only a law degree from the University of Houston Law Center, it was years of grinding work as a public defender who had argued before judges far more imposing than Canon. Crockett had spent the previous night combing through every ruling Canon had issued, every law review piece she'd authored, and every soft spot in her stated philosophy. Your Honor. Crockett began, voice steady with an edge that made the room lean in. I have here your words from a 2019 ruling where you wrote, quote, "Judicial restraint is the cornerstone of constitutional interpretation." Would you explain how that aligns with your recent decisions that legal scholars across the spectrum have called judicial activism at its worst? The room broke into a swell of noise. Republican members tried to object, but Crockett hadn't yielded her time. Canon's face flushed, her calm surface cracking for a beat. She hadn't expected this. No one had. The youngest black woman ever elected from Texas was about to lecture a federal judge on her own ground, and America was about to watch one of the most devastating legal takedowns in the history of congressional oversight. To grasp what was about to unfold, you needed to know who these two women were and why this clash mattered to every viewer. Judge Ailen Canon, appointed to the federal bench in 2020, had become a lightning rod. At 42, she was young by federal standards, with big, firm time at Gibson Dunn and a stint as an assistant U.S. attorney. But it wasn't her resume that made her a household name. It was her rulings. Critics said she bent the law to serve particular political interests. Admirers called her a constitutional originalist, standing firm against governmental overreach. She entered the room wearing authority-like armor. Conservative media had spent weeks elevating her as the intellect who would expose democratic lawfare. Fox News ran segment after segment, promising she'd school liberal members on constitutional doctrine. The Federalist Society issued statements praising her approach. To many conservatives, she was untouchable. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a typical opponent. At 41, the Dallas native had built her reputation in the trenches. Before Congress, she'd been a civil rights attorney who took on cases that looked unwinnable and then won. She'd stood for clients who couldn't pay for counsel, challenged systemic wrongs, and earned a name as someone who did the homework and came ready for the fight. More than anything, she had prepared. While others drafted broad questions about judicial philosophy, Crockett had a research team comb through Canon's every opinion, her student notes, and every public position she'd taken. They turned up contradictions, inconsistencies, and most damaging, a pattern, suggesting Canon's articulated philosophy shifted depending on who stood before her bench. The stakes were enormous. This wasn't just about one judge or one representative. It was about the judiciary's integrity, whether judges could act without accountability, and whether checks and balances still worked. The hearing streamed live on C-SPAN, carried by every major outlet, and trended on social platforms before the gavel dropped. Chairman Jim Jordan had staged the session as a victory lap for Canon, a chance to answer what Republicans framed as unfair attacks from the radical left. He gave her extra time, a full opening statement, and front-loaded friendly questioners. But he made one critical miscalculation. He underestimated Jasmine Crockett. Canon settled in, adjusted the mic with practiced ease, and looked every inch the federal judge, authoritative, composed, faintly dismissive of the surrounding political theater. She held a 20-page opening statement stacked with citations and precedent meant to overawe the panel. Crockett sat silent with a single manila folder and a legal pad jotting notes. To onlookers, it looked like David staring at Goliath. Conservative commentators in the gallery were already posting live reactions about how outmatched she seemed. One wrote, "Crockett looks like a first-year law student headed for a public lesson from a professor." They had no idea what was coming. Committee energy crackled. Democrats like Jerry Nadler and Adam Schiff traded looks, curious what the Texan had planned. Republicans like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene smiled to themselves, expecting another liberal faceplant. Canon launched into her statement with the cadence of someone rarely challenged. Cool, precise, and engineered to assert dominance from word one. "Members of the committee," she began, "I appear before you not only as a federal judge, but as a defender of the constitutional principles that have guided this nation for nearly 250 years. Attacks on my record are not merely attacks on me. They are attacks on the independence of the judiciary itself." Republicans nodded. Jim Jordan even clapped. For 15 minutes, Canon stacked case upon case and precedent upon precedent, building what looked like an impregnable wall of authority. She quoted Scalia reached back to Madison and invoked the founders. It was a master class in judicial rhetoric. Then came softballs from her allies. The friendly prompts let her broaden her narrative. She was the neutral umpire, an independent jurist under siege by partisans. With each nodding question, her confidence swelled. She lectured on interpretation, the judge's role, and the danger of political pressure. Judge Canon. Matt Gaetz asked, "Would you say the criticism you face is just political opponents upset with the outcomes they don't like?" Canon leaned in, a faint smile. "Congressman, when you apply the law faithfully without regard to politics, you will upset those who want judges to act like politicians in robes. I am not, and will never be a politician in a robe." The Republican side applauded. Conservative Twitter lit up Judge Canon. Destroys liberal narrative. Democrats took their turns. The first few asked predictable questions about specific rulings. Canon swatted them away with well-rehearsed lines, cloaking herself in judicial independence. She was winning, and everyone could feel it. Judge Canon Adam Schiff pressed in United States v. Morrison. "Your ruling appears to contradict your own precedent from just 6 months earlier. How do you explain that Canon didn't flinch?" Congressman Schiff, with respect, "I don't think a career politician is qualified to lecture a federal judge on consistency. Each case presents unique facts, and the law must be applied to those facts. Perhaps if you had attended law school, you would appreciate that." Republicans burst into laughter and applause. Schiff froze, blindsided. Canon had just insulted a sitting member of Congress on live TV and got away with it. Her confidence bled into open arrogance. Jerry Nadler tried next, probing her stated philosophy. Canon brushed him off with barely veiled contempt, implying his questions revealed a basic misunderstanding of constitutional method. By the time Jasmine Crockett's turn arrived, Canon was riding high. She'd brushed back every Democrat who challenged her. The hearing felt like a scripted win. Conservative outlets were already drafting their victory takes. Crockett started quietly, almost conversational. Judge Canon, I want to begin with something straightforward. In your 2019 opinion, in State of Florida v. Jackson, you wrote at length about stare decisis, the principle that courts should follow precedent. You called it Rocket glanced at a page. The bedrock upon which legal consistency and public trust in the judiciary rests. Page 47. Do you recall writing that? Canon nodded, a little puzzled by the soft open. Of course, I stand by every word, excellent, Crockett said, sliding a document from her folder. Then perhaps you can explain why, in 7 cases over the past 2 years, you explicitly departed from your own precedents without any change in law or facts. The smile drained from Canon's face. Crockett didn't pause. Let's be precise. In United States v. Chen, March 2022, you wrote that prosecutorial discretion is nearly absolute, and courts should not second-guess charging decisions. 4 months later in United States v. Williams, with near-identical facts, you held that prosecutorial discretion is subject to robust judicial review. The only material difference, the defendant's political affiliation. Canon drew breath to answer, but Crockett lifted a hand. I'm not finished. Your Honor, and in this chamber I have the floor. The room went still. No one talked to Judge Canon like that. In your confirmation hearing, Crockett continued producing another transcript. You swore you'd never discussed your judicial philosophy with political organizations. Yet I have a video of a 2018 Federalist Society event where you delivered a 45-minute presentation on precisely that topic. Would you like me to play it? Canon flushed. Congresswoman, I believe you're mischaracterizing Am I Crockett cut in, because I have the video right here. Shall we watch together? I'm especially interested in the portion where you say, quote, judges have a duty to interpret the law in ways that advance certain societal goals. That doesn't sound like the neutral arbiter you've claimed to be today. Republicans moved to intervene. Jim Jordan struck the gavel. The gentlewoman's time is limited. I have 7 minutes remaining, Mr. Chairman, Crockett replied without looking up. I intend to use every second. She turned back to Canon, who was gripping the table's edge. Judge Canon, let's discuss United States v. Patterson. You dismissed charges citing prosecutorial misconduct. But I have internal emails legally obtained through FOIA from your chambers showing you decided to dismiss before the prosecution even argued. One email from you to your clerk reads, we need to find a reason to dismiss Patterson, dated 3 days before the hearing. How is that not prejudgment? Those emails are out of context, Canon managed. Context. Crockett's voice rose for the first time. Here's context. In the last 3 years, you ruled in favor of defendants sharing certain political views 94% of the time. That isn't blind justice, that's political bias wearing a robe. Democrats erupted. Republicans shouted objections. Jordan hammered the gavel. Crockett pressed on. I have a statistical analysis by 3 separate law schools, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, covering over 500 of your rulings. Their conclusion: your methodology changes with the political stakes. Stricter standing for cases brought by liberals, looser for conservatives. Textualist here, purposivist there, whichever gets the desired end. These accusations are outrageous, Canon said, voice tight. Are they? Crockett lifted a thick packet. Because I have 73 pages of examples. We can go case by case. Let's start with Environmental Defense Fund v., where you suddenly found standing barriers you'd rejected 2 months earlier, in Americans for Prosperity. Chaos rolled across the room. Republicans demanding order, Democrats insisting she continue C-SPAN cameras, catching Canon's shock and Crockett's implacable calm. Jordan threatened to clear the gallery to restore quiet. When he finally did, Crockett's tone settled into the certainty of someone who knew the balance had already shifted. Judge Canon, one more matter likely the most important. She lifted a final document. United States v. Thompson, a single mother of 3, charged with failing to report $8,000. She faced 5 years. You denied every motion for leniency. Your sentencing. The law must be applied equally without regard to personal circumstances. Crockett let it hang. That same week, United States v. Hartley wealthy executive $3.2 million in evaded taxes. You granted every defense motion, allowed long delays, and sentenced him to probation. Your words. The court must consider the full context of the defendant's life and circumstances. She looked at Canon. Explain to this committee and to the American people why a mother trying to feed her kids goes to prison while a millionaire who dodged millions gets probation. Canon opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence was deafening. Let me help, Crockett said, voice low. Ms. Thompson had a public defender. No campaign checks, no society memberships. Mr. Hartley's attorney sits on the board of the same conservative legal group that recommended you for the bench. His wife serves on your state's judicial selection committee. I'm sure that's just coincidence. Applause broke on the Democratic side. Some Republicans looked down. The evidence lay there, documented, specific, impossible to wave away. Canon tried again. You're taking these situations out of context. Each case is unique. Context, Crockett echoed sharper now. I've been a public defender. I've begged judges to consider context for my clients. Judges like you said, the law is the law. Odd how context only appears for people who can fight back. She pulled out her phone. I want to show you something. This is a video from Ms. Thompson's daughter. She's 14. She recorded it yesterday when she learned you'd be testifying. A teenager appeared on screen looking into the camera. Judge Canon, you sent my mom to prison for trying to take care of us. She made a mistake and owned it. You said our circumstances didn't matter. My little brother still cries for her every night. We lost our home. I had to leave school to work. You let rich people who stole millions walk. How is that justice? The room froze. People in the gallery wiped at their eyes. Canon's composure collapsed. Crockett's voice carried quiet but resolute. That young woman wanted to be here today, but she couldn't miss work. Unlike defendants who get your mercy, her family's still paying for your brand of justice. She spread more files across the table. I have 47 similar cases, single parents, hourly workers, people who made small mistakes and met your full wrath, and 23 cases where wealthy connected defendants walked away with slaps on the wrist. The pattern is obvious. Your Honor, 2 systems of justice, one for the powerful and one for everybody else. Canon tried a last pivot. Congresswoman, you're not a judge. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly. Crockett shot back. I understand you've lost sight of what justice means. I understand your courtroom has become a political tool. And I understand you've betrayed the oath that robe represents. She gathered her papers, then paused. One final question, Judge Canon. Think carefully, because you're under oath. The air held. Can you look at that young woman's video, and honestly, say you've applied the law equally to everyone who came before you? Canon sat still silent for 10 seconds, 20-30. Cameras captured each beat of the non-answer, what should have been the simplest assurance a judge could give. Chairman Jordan finally pounded the gavel. "I yield back," Crockett said, taking her seat. The damage was done. Judge Canon's prepared lines were useless against the stacked record on the table. When Republicans tried to rehabilitate her with friendly questions, her answers turned halting and thin. The earlier swagger was gone, replaced by the look of someone suddenly exposed and unable to justify what the public had just seen. The hearing technically continued for another hour, but the outcome was already written. Every line of questioning from that point forward seemed to orbit the examples Crockett had laid out. Democrats, newly energized by what they'd just witnessed, pressed on with specifics that echoed her documentation. Some Republicans kept to their scripts, but the energy had shifted. Even a few on the majority side looked uneasy as the record on the table refused to be wished away. When Judge Canon finally rose from the witness chair, she moved quickly, eyes avoiding the gallery. The woman who had entered with absolute confidence now looked shaken, exposed, and most damaging for a judge unable to defend her own choices. Within minutes of adjournment, the clip of Crockett's 7-minute sequence tore across social media. Crockett exposes Canon rocketed to the top of trends worldwide. The teenager's video spread at lightning speed, millions of views piling up as legal communities and ordinary viewers alike processed what they'd seen. Legal. Twitter flooded with threads unpacking each case. Crockett cited, matching the claims against public dockets, and reporting the same patterns back the analysis checked out. On air, CNN's longtime legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin looked stunned. In 4 decades of covering courts, he said, "I can't recall a federal judge so comprehensively dismantled in a public forum." Representative Crockett didn't just grill Judge Canon. She presented a structured case that would survive in any courtroom. Over at Fox, the early spin called it a partisan attack. A prime-time host framed it as political theater. But even some conservative legal voices hesitated to defend what had been exposed. In The Hill, Professor Jonathan Turley wrote that the compilation raised serious questions about judicial bias that cannot be shrugged off as mere politics. By midweek, the Judicial Conference of the United States announced a preliminary review of the matters flagged in the hearing. 3 state bar associations called for formal ethics inquiries. Scholars across the ideological spectrum signed an open letter urging accountability mechanisms to address what they termed pattern-level deviations in judicial behavior. And yet the consequences reached beyond a single judge. Crockett's meticulous research, targeted exemplars, and an unmistakable pattern instantly became the new benchmark for oversight of the federal judiciary. Law schools began assigning the hearing transcript in advocacy and professional responsibility courses. The teenager whose message had cut through the jargon found herself at the center of a national conversation about sentencing fairness. Donations poured in for her education, and she spoke at reform panels about how a judge's decision can reverberate through a family's life. Her mother's case quickly became a shorthand example in debates over equal justice. Judge Canon tried to ride out the storm. She released a carefully worded statement dismissing the hearing as political spectacle and insisting that her opinions were grounded in law. But the more independent analyses accumulated, and the more additional rulings surfaced that fit the same pattern, the less sustainable that posture became. Within 3 months, she was quietly reassigned to a reduced civil docket. Several of her contested decisions were reversed on appeal with higher courts, citing clear legal error judicial language for the deeper problem Crockett had highlighted in plain English. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett vaulted into national prominence. Her alma mater announced a scholarship in her name. Invitations arrived from the American Bar Association, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and Law Schools across the country. Her social following exploded by the millions. More consequential than any of that, a criminal justice reform bill she had fought to advance, stuck in committee. For months, suddenly attracted scores of co-sponsors. Still, she kept the focus off herself. In a 60 Minutes interview, she said, "This was never about me versus Judge Canon. It was about the promise we make in this country that justice is blind and the law applies equally. When judges forget that promise, it's our responsibility to remind them." Politically, the hearing scrambled expectations. Republicans who had planned to hold Canon up as an emblem of judicial persecution now found themselves scrambling for safer ground. Senators who'd once touted her jurisprudence began hedging. The Federalist Society stopped featuring her as a speaker. Democrats, galvanized, initiated broader inquiries into systematic bias. They embraced Crockett's framework, show the pattern, prove the inconsistencies, and tie them to concrete outcomes. Within half a year, 3 other federal judges encountered similar scrutiny. 2 opted to retire rather than face hearings. Legal scholars would later call the day a hinge point. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe wrote that Representative Crockett had done more in one session to restore faith in congressional oversight than years of prior efforts demonstrating that preparation and proof could still check power. The image that endured wasn't Canon's assured entrance or her faltering exit. It was the split screen during that final question, Crockett standing firm behind a table strewn with documents, and the judge silent, unable to answer whether she had applied the law equally. 6 months later, the teenager from the video received a full college scholarship from an anonymous donor. The accompanying note read, "Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Keep going." People drew their own conclusions about who sent it. The mystery only amplified the moment's resonance. Judge Canon's reputation never recovered. Historians would later note that her public standing ended not with a formal sanction, but with a question she could not answer. Crockett, by contrast, kept pushing in Congress, armed now with a national platform and bipartisan respect from attorneys who might disagree with her politics, but admired her command of the record. When a young law student asked what advice she'd give to those challenging power, Crockett said, "Do the homework. Know their record better than they do. And remember, facts are the great equalizer. Power can intimidate, but it can't out-argue evidence." Reform didn't stop at the waterline of that one hearing. New standards for judicial transparency took shape, including periodic disclosures on sentencing patterns and regular audits to test consistency across similar cases. Analysts coined the Thompson-Hartley test, named for the 2 matters Crockett contrasted, as a way to examine whether equal law was being applied to unequal defendants. A year on the ABA gave Crockett its Champion of Justice Award. She dedicated it to public defenders who fight for equal treatment and to defendants who never received it. The ovation reportedly lasted 5 minutes. A prominent legal blog summed up the moment this way: Crockett didn't just win a viral exchange. She raised the bar for judicial accountability. Every federal judge now knows rulings are being tracked, and patterns good or habits will be championed. 2 years out, Judge Canon mentioned the hearing only in a single paragraph of her memoir. "I was unprepared for the depth of analysis Representative Crockett brought to bear. In retrospect, I should have been more aware of how my rulings might look in the aggregate. Every judge should learn from that experience." It was the closest she came to an admission. The case files Crockett had referenced were digitized and made public, quickly becoming a standard resource for researchers probing bias in judicial outcomes. The Brennan Center for Justice launched something new, the Crockett database, to track trends in rulings nationwide. Within its first year, researchers identified worrisome patterns in dozens of courts, prompting targeted reforms and affecting millions. But perhaps the most profound shift took place in the hearts of aspiring lawyers. The sight of a first-term representative dismantling a well-defended narrative, using only primary documents. A methodical structure and patient restraint changed how a generation thought about advocacy. Law school applications from underrepresented communities spiked, with many applicants citing the hearing as their inspiration. In the courthouse where Canon had once presided, public defenders reported subtle but real changes. More reasonable plea negotiations, greater care in sentencing explanations, and a general sense that each case might be part of a larger pattern someone could surface later. The specter of becoming the next judge, exposed for bias, proved a powerful deterrent. 3 years after the hearing, Congress passed the Equal Justice Act, mandating annual reviews of sentencing disparities and establishing a civilian oversight board for the federal courts, a measure informally dubbed Crockett's Law. At the signing, Jasmine Crockett stood behind the president, the same folder in her hands that she'd carried into the hearing room. The image of that folder, ordinary manila, bulging with receipts, became a symbol for a simple idea. Power is not proof. Documentation is. Ms. Thompson, the mother in the case that had torn at the room, was ultimately released on appeal, her sentence reduced to time served. When she walked out, Crockett was there to meet her. The photo of their embrace, her children around them, became one of the most shared images of the year, captioned by countless users, with a phrase the teenager had spoken: "Justice delayed, but finally delivered." Professional responsibility classes across the country began requiring students to watch the key moments from the hearing. The final question: can you honestly say you've applied the law equally, acquired a nickname, simply the question? Professors used it as a litmus test for judicial integrity, challenging students to consider how they would defend their own records if subjected to the same scrutiny. Eventually, Judge Canon left the bench entirely and moved into private practice, focusing on corporate compliance, advising organizations on withstanding rigorous review. She declined public interviews about the hearing, but colleagues said she kept a photo from that day on her desk, not of herself, but of Crockett standing at the microphone. A reminder, perhaps, of how quickly power can dissolve under the heat of accountable truth. The ripple effects spread outward. Courts adopted dashboards to flag outlier sentencing. Confirmation hearings for judicial nominees began to feature data-driven questioning modeled on Crockett's approach. Practitioners coined a term for the technique "pulling a Crockett," meaning to expose contradictions with a carefully built record from the subject's own words and decisions. 5 years after that fateful day, Jasmine Crockett raised her right hand and took an oath as a federal judge, nominated by a president who cited her unyielding commitment to equal justice and confirmed with bipartisan votes. In her investiture, she promised to remember that justice isn't about the judge, but about the people standing before the bench. Commentators noted the symmetry. The woman who had asked the question would now be responsible for living up to it, answerable to the same standard she'd demanded of others. At a graduation ceremony, soon after the young woman whose video had riveted the nation crossed the stage to accept her law degree. The keynote speaker was Judge Jasmine Crockett. Years ago, she told the graduates a brave teenager reminded the country that behind every caption and case number stands a human story. Justice is not abstract. It's personal. It must be equal. The auditorium rose in a standing ovation as that young woman, now a new lawyer, announced she would become a public defender. A documentary titled "The Question How Jasmine Crockett Changed American Justice" aired to critical acclaim, and won multiple Emmys. It featured scholars, defendants affected by disparate rulings, and even judges who admitted the hearing made them rethink their approach. A former clerk of Canon's, speaking anonymously, said the quiet part out loud. That day changed us. We all asked ourselves, could I answer that question? Beyond U.S. borders, the hearing was cited by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in a report on accountability. The European Union invited Crockett to speak on legislative oversight. Law faculties in Tokyo and London built case studies around the method. 10 years later, the Harvard Law Review ranked the confrontation among the most consequential congressional hearings in American history, alongside the Army McCarthy and Watergate hearings. The editors wrote that where other sessions exposed corruption or abuse, this one revealed something more pervasive: the subtle systematic tilt in justice that quietly denies equal treatment and then sparked reforms that actually stuck. On the 10th anniversary, NPR aired a retrospective featuring people whose lives had shifted because of the post-hearing reforms. A small business owner described avoiding prison thanks to more balanced guidelines. A wealthy executive described being held properly accountable under standards that treated his status as irrelevant. Public defenders spoke of benches more careful with explanations, more consistent across similar facts. The most striking interview was with Ms. Thompson's son, the little brother who had cried every night, now a criminal justice major. He said Representative Crockett didn't just expose one judge. She showed us someone was watching. She gave us hope the system could change, and it did. That same day, Crockett released a memoir, The Question, with proceeds funding legal aid. I walked into that room with a folder and a question she wrote. I walked out with a movement. But the heroes are the families who lived under unequal justice and still found the courage to speak. For the first time, Judge Canon, now fully retired, issued a brief statement acknowledging what many had long believed the hearing had been a turning point for American justice. She called accountability responsibility, not persecution. Observers noted it was the nearest she'd come to recognizing the validity of what had been shown. Over time, the standard Crockett championed took root. Bias, once hidden in single decisions, became visible when mapped across a judge's full docket. The question, can you honestly say you've applied the law, equally shifted from a rhetorical flourish to an expectation enforced by data and review. The teenager at the center of the flashpoint became a public defender, later a reform-minded prosecutor, and ultimately a judge. When she took her oath, Judge Jasmine Crockett administered it, completing the circle. My mother went to prison because a judge forgot that justice should be blind, the new judge said. Today, I swear never to forget. Historians would mark the hearing as the moment American justice began nudging back toward its ideals. Not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. And it began with a first-term Congresswoman from Texas who did her homework, brought receipts, and asked a question a federal judge could not answer. The folder Crockett carried that day sits in the Smithsonian, now part of an exhibit on moments that changed the nation. Next to it lies the transcript opened to the page, with the final exchange. Visitors stand long minutes absorbing the simplicity of the ask and the weight of the silence that followed. A small placard reads, "On this day, Representative Jasmine Crockett reminded America that truth armed with evidence can still confront privilege and win. Justice is not about who you are, but about what is right. One prepared voice can make the system bend." Each year on the anniversary, first-year law students watch the footage. The judge's confidence draining the Congresswoman's steady resolve the instant when a question becomes a reckoning. Faculty tell them the lesson is not to seek a dramatic moment, but to build a record so sturdy it speaks for itself. Methodical, documented, fearless. The hearing room itself earned a new informal name, the Crocket Chamber. A small plaque by the door carries her line from that day. Justice isn't about the judge. It's about the people who stand before us. Anyone entering to testify or to question sees at first a reminder that authority is temporary, but answerability endures. In casebooks now, Judge Ailen Canon's name appears as a caution, an object lesson in how patterns once seen in full can eclipse any single opinion. In those same pages, Jasmine Crockett stands as the representative who reset expectations for how the people's branch can check the judicial one, armed not with bluster, but with facts. Oversight. Her work demonstrated isn't theater. It's the guardianship of equal justice under law. If this story moved you, pitting courage against privilege and proof against power, share it with someone who needs to remember that systems can change. Leave a note about a time you watched truth prevail, or a time you spoke up when it was hard. Justice isn't a favor bestowed by the powerful. It's a right we defend daily. And as the day in the hearing room showed, sometimes everything turns on one question asked at the right moment with the evidence to sustain it.